The light appeared and shot me straight into the sky. For a moment, I could see the entire maze and the land surrounding it. Directly opposite our house, separated by the immensity of the maze, was a green lake, sunk in a deep basin at the foot of the far mountains. It was beautiful, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming desire to see it up close. It was a fleeting feeling, for the ball of light was soon hurtling back toward the earth, driven by the force which, moments ago, it had been defying. It hit the ground with a massive concussion, leaving a large crater that could easily have become a lake only slightly smaller than the green one I had just seen. I was surprisingly unhurt. The light held me suspended in its center and patted my landing before fading away. I was surrounded by tall, rounded hills, each a brighter hue than the last. I climbed the first, a turquoise mound the height of a small building. The ground was squishy, and so smooth that it was hard to keep my footing. When I finally reached the top, I could see miles of them, stretching out as far as I could see, an ocean of orange and blue and pink and green. It looked like the cover of the Sweet Adventure box. I slid down the blue hill and began to climb a slightly shorter orange one, without any sense of where I was going or what I needed to do. I just followed my instincts and climbed. I was standing atop a bright yellow hill surveying the land when a dark speck appeared in the sky. It was far off, but approaching swiftly. The dark mass grew larger and larger as it sped toward me, and soon it was close enough for me to see that it was a dragon. I'd never seen a dragon. They were thought to be purely mythical in Crystal River, though Valencia had told me that there had been a whole brood of them in Norg Hollow when she was a girl. In my childhood, they existed only in fables, and were usually long and sleek, like giant flying serpents. This dragon was not. It was round, so roly-poly that it was hard to understand how it could fly so fast, with only 2 tiny wings supporting its immense girth. Its skin was covered with scales of deep emerald green, and speckled with small crystals, and its eyes were orange and angry as it charged toward me. It flew over my head twice, creating winds so strong I was unable to stay on my feet, and I fell to the soft, trembling ground. Duma fell out of my pack as I landed, and before I could put him back, he began to sing. The words were foreign, but the melody was sweet and familiar. It was a song I remembered from my early childhood, something my mother sang to me in the evenings before putting me to bed. The memory flooded over me, and I was powerless. I could only sit and sob. The song continued for some time. I slowly became aware of my surroundings, and I jumped up, whirling around to locate the dragon. Duma was still singing, so low the words were lost in the hum of his voice. There was no sign of the dragon. I crept to the edge and looked down. Cradled between the 2 hills below was the dragon, sleeping peacefully with a small, contented smile on its fearsome face. It stirred as I approached, and Duma stopped singing. The silence around us was sudden and complete. There was no sound of animal or bird in this strange land. The dragon snorted, shooting small flames from each nostril. Duma spoke softly. "Nephil, mightiest of the dragons, most powerful of the Westgal tribe, awake and meet your new mistress." The giant eyes opened, and Nephil sat up. He yawned and rubbed his eyes like a small child waking from a nap. There was no longer any anger in his expression. He looked at me warmly and grinned, showing all of his sharp teeth. "Hello, mistress. I am Nephil of the Westgal tribe, mightiest of the dragons. I will aid you in your final test, and if you are victorious, I will join you when you once again stand on the shores of Norg Hollow. My family lived there long ago, before they were brutally slain by the Miasha clan, or kidnapped and sold to the other worlds by the Raskies." His face was briefly somber before resuming its jovial expression. He seemed like a cheerful dragon, something I had not expected. He was as friendly as a puppy, and we chatted for a few minutes, though he had a very limited attention span. He carried me back to the center of the maze, dropping me softly a few yards from the clearing, where Blade and Evelyn waited. At Duma's insistence, I crept quietly forward, while Nephil flew away. I could barely hear them over the splashing of the fountain. "There's no use being kind to her. The end is near. I have collected all I need, even without your cooperation. I doubt she will last very long against them. What are you trying to gain? You cannot exist without me. If I die, you die." "Not necessarily." Not immediately, perhaps, but you will slowly wither away, haunted by that missing piece of your soul. You will have to fight her eventually. Why not join me now, when it's a sure thing? I can't. Very well, you're on your own. I will not have time to watch out for you once it begins. Duma began thrashing around in the backpack, and I quietly unzipped the bag. This is very odd, he whispered. Always before they were united for the final trial. Even with your mother, it was true. Nick seduced her away from me, and I hated her in the end. I closed the bag without replying. I was angry. My mother was a sacred subject, and I couldn't listen to him abusing her memory without feeling a fiery rage deep in the pit of my stomach. Evelyn and Blade were silent. I hoped that they had not heard Duma or felt his presence. He was going against his promise and becoming more vocal and impatient as the game went on. I was beginning to question which side he was actually on. He had helped calm the dragon and made him pledge his loyalty to me, but I couldn't help feeling that Duma was beginning to draw Evelyn to him. I saw her looking intensely at my bag several times, and more often as the game progressed. She felt him. He was too close to her, and whether he meant to or not, he was calling to her. He was calm now, silent and motionless inside the backpack. I shook my head. There was nothing I could do about Duma now. I took one last deep breath and stepped into the clearing where they were both waiting for me, watching the entrance and expectant of my return. Chapter 10. A heavy silence hung over the clearing as I took my place and looked at each of them in turn. Evelyn kept her eyes focused on the board, but I could see the impatience and rage on her face. The end was coming. She couldn't wait much longer. I looked at her for a little while, thinking about how I would have to kill her. It was the only way I could survive, but it still worried me. I hoped I would be able to do it when the time came. Blade's eyes met mine as I turned to him. He smiled, but his face was worried. He looked as handsome as ever, and the thought of destroying him was something I couldn't consider. He looked at my pocket, where the card he had given me was glowing brighter than ever. Evelyn saw it. Her dark little eyes went wide with rage, and she jumped up. Enough! This ends now! The game is over! She screamed and threw down a small pouch of sand. It glowed red against the game board for a moment, before exploding up into the air. It created a massive sandstorm, and I lost sight of Blade and Evelyn. The swirling sands made it impossible to see anything that was more than a foot away. It got into my eyes and nose and burned like fire. I covered my face with my hands and waited. After a while, the winds slowed. The sand settled on my shoulders and hair, and I lowered my hands. The maze was gone. There was no hedge to be seen, just miles and miles of forest, populated with thin red trees that looked as if they were made of glass. Blade and Evelyn were nowhere to be seen. I ignored the feeling of pure terror in the pit of my stomach and began to walk through the trees in an uncertain direction. I didn't think it would matter what direction I chose. Evelyn was out for blood, and she would find me. I just needed to be prepared. The forest was absolutely silent. Even my footsteps were muted by the hard brown earth. I continued slowly through the trees, looking all around, but seeing nothing except the brown rolling hills beyond. I stopped. There was no point in exhausting myself before I had to fight. I leaned against a tree and waited. I would make them come to me. I didn't have to wait long. There was a horn call from far off, and the ground began to tremble with the concussion of gigantic footsteps. Evelyn appeared through the tall, spindly trees, riding on the shoulder of a giant. Another fairy tale come to life. He towered above the trees and mimicked their shape, tall and incredibly thin. He wore a long red robe and carried a huge, ornate sword the color of rubies. There was a long scratch down his face, dripping blood and matching the fresh one on Evelyn's cheek. He bellowed and charged forward with the sword lowered at me, ready to skewer me. I scrambled quickly off to the side, and he drove his sword through several trees, shattering them into 1,000 jagged pieces. I darted in and out of the trees, trying to put distance between us, but he was at my heels in a moment. I could hear Evelyn screaming and encouraging him to slice off my head. Suddenly, Duma's voice thundered out of my backpack. His roar stopped the giant in his tracks, but Evelyn became crazed. She whipped the giant and urged him on with even more vehemence. She knew she had found her missing piece. The giant's indecision gave me just enough time to put a hill between us. As I ran down the other side, the dirt gave way under my feet, sending me straight down into a hidden cave. I had vanished by the time the giant cleared the hill, and he froze in confusion. Evelyn kept screaming. Her shrill commands were cut short by the sound of wings and rushing wind. From my hiding place, I saw the bulbous shape of Nafil pass overhead. The effect of his collision with the giant was deafening, and the earth shook around me. I heard Evelyn cry out and saw her fall from her perch and run away. The giant and dragon were entwined in a vicious battle. The dragon tore into the giant's arm with his sharp little teeth. The giant retaliated with a blow from his mighty sword, but the emerald scales repelled the attack without leaving a mark. There was fear in the giant's voice as he called out, raising his hands to his face as Nafil lunged forward, taking his neck in his teeth and crunching down hungrily. The giant fell. A river of blood coursed from his open throat. Nafil turned and saw me. He nodded to me as I ignored my fear and revulsion and struggled out of the cave. My service to you is complete. I wish you the best of luck, mistress. You will need it. He jumped straight into the sky and flew away. He disappeared just as Evelyn came over the hill to my left. She was not alone. A man stood at her side. It was not Blade. I had not seen him since the sandstorm, but there had been little time to wonder where he had gone. The man beside Evelyn held my attention now. He was clearly the next challenge, and I wondered what was in store for me. He was dressed all in black. The only speck of color on him was a red silk handkerchief tied around his throat. The wide brim of his black hat hid his eyes, but I could see a black waxed mustache perched above his menacing smile. He carried a mace in one hand and a long black whip in the other. With one swift flick of his wrist, the man wrapped the whip around my ankles and knocked me to the ground. My fingers clawed at the earth, trying to hold on while he dragged me toward him. Evelyn sat off to one side on a fallen tree. A shattered branch had cut her leg, but she was oblivious to the blood pooling at her feet. Her entire being was focused on me and awaited my imminent destruction. The man pulled me to him and plucked the bag from my back. I clung to it, fighting with what strength remained, until he kicked me in the jaw. Lights flashed before my eyes, and I let go. He tossed the bag to Evelyn. She snatched it out of the air, tore it open, and pulled out Duma. "Dumavine," she purred, holding the book lovingly but with malice in her eyes. "I've missed you. It has been so many years since we parted, and I have had such difficulty finding you. You have been very evasive, but now we are reunited. There is only one more thing we need." "No." Duma's voice was a hoarse whisper. He sounded very afraid. "The fresh spilled blood of the last witch of Norg Hollow." She gave the man a nod, and he pulled the whip from my ankles. "Stand up." He had a thick accent that I couldn't place. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair that fell to his waist. I could finally see his eyes, and that was when I began to be afraid. The look in his eyes was pure evil. There was no anger, no remorse, no hint of any emotion, just the darkest power known in this world, and probably all others. I stood before him with my body frozen in terror. I knew I was going to die, but I couldn't find the words to save myself. All spells were lost to me, and all I could do was stand there and watch him. My hands fell to my sides, and I bowed my head. I gave up and prepared to die a failure to my ancestors. I was not strong enough to keep the dark power from coming back into this world. As he raised the mace high above his head, my hand fell on the card in my pocket. Blade's heart. I took it out and held it over my heart, my head still bowed, waiting for the blow to fall. The card glowed in my hand and became red hot. It burned my fingers, and I dropped it on the ground. It cast a beam of red light into the sky that reflected off the trees and blinded the man, who lowered his mace to shield his eyes from the intense glare. Evelyn stood with her hands over her eyes and was unaware as I slipped past her. There was a cry from the hill above, and Blade stood silhouetted against the lights bouncing off the trees. He held the club in one hand and the purple and blue pot in the other. He ran at the man in black with the club held high, As he passed, he tossed me the pot, which I managed to clumsily catch without spilling the contents. Blade brought the club down toward the man's exposed head, but he countered with his mace and whipped Blade's feet out from under him in one fluid movement. I set the pot down and ran back to help Blade, but Evelyn tackled me. I went down hard. We fought and clawed at each other, but I couldn't focus on her. The man stood over Blade with a cruel smile on his lips. He held the mace just above Blade's face, letting it drop every so often to scratch the tip of his nose. Blade was pinned down under the man's large black boot, and the whip bound his hands. I tried to move, but Evelyn had me pinned. I watched in horror as the man raised the mace and swung it around his head a few times. I managed to work my hands down to the dagger I had tied at my waist. I silently blessed Valencia in her insistence that I dressed like a witch. It was proving very useful. I managed to get the knife up near Evelyn's hand. The man was still swinging the mace, and Evelyn was absorbed in watching him. In one swift motion, I cut her fingers from her hand and pushed her away. She cried out as blood spurted out of the stubs, but I had already turned and plunged my knife deep into the man's abdomen. His eyes bulged, but he didn't utter a sound. The mace fell, and Blade rolled out of the way just in time. I cut the whip from his wrists. Evelyn threw herself at me and knocked me down. The knife flew out of my hand. The man staggered after Blade, again raising the mace. Evelyn dug her nails into my arm, and I struggled to break free. She bit me on the shoulder, drawing blood and spitting a piece of my flesh onto the ground. She grinned at me, a hideous, bloody grin that made my insides churn. Blade ran to the purple and blue pot. I had left it near the base of a tree, and he grabbed it and climbed up into the branches. He called to his sister, drawing her attention from the taste of my blood, and her eyes grew round. She released me and raced to the nearest tree as Blade cast the pot down, shattering it on the ground. "Casey, get over here." I ran to him, and he grabbed my arm, pulling me into the tree beside him. One of the lower branches broke when I stepped on it, slicing open my leg and spilling blood on the ground. Below us, amidst the pieces of broken pottery, were snakes. Their bodies were so black that they shone blue and purple in the sun. As they writhered over each other, they multiplied and slithered toward the man in black. He was dazed from losing so much blood and unable to run. He screamed and flailed his arms as he tried in vain to escape. The snakes swarmed over him and devoured him as they went. When there was nothing left of his body, they lay, full and content, in the warm sun, and fell asleep. Evelyn cursed her brother and I in a foreign tongue. Blade spoke back in the same language, and an argument broke out between them. Their words were sharp and took shape in the air. Something was growing. It hung like a heavy gray cloud between them. As they argued, their voices rose until the earth shook and the pitch became unbearable. It was cut short by the steady thump of thousands of marching feet. Over the hills came the elves and fairies, armed with swords, clubs, knives, and bows. They formed a wide circle around the three of us. They wouldn't look at us, but gazed steadily just above our heads, without speaking a word. I felt afraid as I looked at their solemn faces and fierce weapons. Without taking my eyes off them, I slipped my hand into my pocket and felt the amulet Valencia had given me. I didn't remember putting it there, but I stroked the smooth stone and was comforted by it. There was a loud sound, and trees began popping up all around us. They weren't like the red trees. They looked like they were made of some kind of cookie, and would have been perfect growing around the home of the old woman with all the cats. These trees bore faces, and they were angry. We were surrounded. They towered menacingly above us. One raised Evelyn to its face and sniffed her. It placed her on its shoulder, and she laughed, her voice deepening and growing shrill in turns. The trees closed in around us. Blade and I stood with our backs touching, unable to escape. Then Duma began to sing. He was laying amongst the trees, abandoned and forgotten in Evelyn's desire to see me destroyed. He was singing a deep, melodious tune, which drew the attention of the trees. While they were distracted, I dove through a space between their roots and crept unseen through them. Evelyn noticed my absence and began shouting. In the confusion, I grabbed Duma and ran. The fairies and elves were seated in the branches of the red trees and watched us with detached expressions. They whistled in unison when they saw me and pointed out my direction. The trees lumbered after me. "Casey, the vial! Get the vial!" Duma screamed over the thunderous pounding of the trees' footsteps. I patted my pockets and pulled out the small vial, Valencia's last attempt to save me. I looked at the label, the word gooey emblazoned on the tag in shimmering letters. Evelyn was cackling and urging the trees onward. I had no other options. I opened the bottle. Immediately I heard Valencia's voice, calm and melodious, calling gooey over and over again. There was a strange sound, kind of like waves rolling into the shore, but thicker. Over the hills came a huge pudding-like creature. His face was friendly, and he smiled as he lifted me in one messy hand and Blade in the other. He oozed over to the tallest of the red trees and placed us safely among the silent, watching fairies. The other trees froze when Gooey appeared, and a deep silence fell over the strange forest. Only Evelyn continued shrieking orders and kicking the tree on which she rode. Her tiny feet dislodged pieces of the tree, and large crumbs crashed to the ground. Gooey seemed agitated by the sound of her voice, and he turned in her direction. He rolled forward, absorbing the trees into his massive form, and didn't slow his progress as he closed in on Evelyn. Her screams were muffled as she disappeared into a thick, chocolatey doom. He rolled lazily over the rest of the trees, but the battle was over the moment Evelyn vanished. The fairies and elves left immediately. Their faces remained blank and bored as they flitted away. Gooey slopped over and lifted us down from our perch. He smiled at us, and then slid over the hills and out of sight. A powerful wind picked up and swirled all around us. Blade wrapped his arms around me, and we lowered our heads against the red sand that once again blocked out everything around us. I held Duma tight against me until the winds died down. We were once again in the center of the maze. As we parted, I noticed Blade looked sick. His face was pale, and he swayed slightly, as if gravity was too strong, and he had to constantly fight against it. Dropping Duma to the ground, I took Blade's hands. They were ice-cold and clammy. He tried to give me a weak smile, but his legs gave out, and he slumped to the ground. I sat with him and cradled his head in my lap. After a while, he finally seemed to notice me again, and he smiled. "Casey." His voice was a ragged whisper. I smiled and tried to keep my expression reassuring as I waited for him to continue. It took a few minutes. His breathing was labored and harsh. He struggled to form the words. "You have to kill me. You have to." No. I couldn't stop the tears that rolled down my face. One landed on his cheek, and he cried out in pain. "You have to, Casey. I must be destroyed. I don't want to hurt you, but I will if you let me live. Please do it quickly. There's so much pain. The other one wants to return, and I am doing everything I can to fight it off, but I am so weak." He began coughing. His body convulsed and his face was twisted in agony. There was a small trickle of blood at the corner of his mouth when the coughing subsided. He looked at me with eyes so full of pain that I could not refuse his request. I looked around, unsure of how to do it. All traces of the battle were gone except for the giant's sword. It lay at the bottom of the fountain, shrunken and dull without the magic of the other world. In the sun it cast a red glow up from the murky water. I tried to lift the sword. It was much heavier than I expected, but I spoke a few quick words for strength and pulled it out. I dragged it behind me as I slowly approached Blade. He lay on the ground, staring straight up at the sky, but his eyes saw nothing until I stood over him. He smiled at me and softly spoke my name. His voice was almost gone. I knelt over him and kissed his forehead. He pulled me down to him and gathered all his remaining energy for one last kiss. I pulled away so my tears wouldn't hurt him again. They coursed down my face as I raised the sword high above my head. Blade smiled and closed his eyes. His expression was one of pure peace. He didn't say another word, and I closed my eyes as I brought the blade down. Chapter 11. I have no idea how long I sat in the maze and cried. I cried for Blade and for Valencia and for myself. My life had been painfully lonely until the last few months. I had learned so much about love and family, and now it was all gone. I felt cheated, Every person I loved, who had loved me in return, had been taken from me. I wondered if I was cursed to lead a solitary life. It seemed probable. Witches were not easily accepted in this world, and though I longed to go find Norg Hollow, I had no idea how to begin. The twists and turns of the maze were easier this time, and I needed no one to help me find my way. As I exited the maze, I instinctively glanced up at the library window. I expected to see Valencia standing there, in her crazy old lady persona, muttering and signing with her hands. For a moment, I did see her. But then I blinked, and she was gone. I dropped my things on the bench in the garden and sat down in the grass next to it. My heart ached like it never had before. The depth of my grief was astounding, as if I felt the loss of all the witches before me, and not just Valencia and my mother. The loss of Blade was something I couldn't even think about. Not yet. It was too soon, and I couldn't accept it. I still expected him to appear at the edge of the woods, smiling his mischievous smile, and ready for fun. I sat for a long time staring silently at the maze. I was unsure of what to do next. "May I make a suggestion?" Duma's voice startled me. I had forgotten I wasn't alone. I didn't reply. I couldn't. I found that I hated him. He was all I had left of everyone I loved, and he was an evil, pompous shell of the man who had once been my father. "Casey, leave me alone. You're not finished. There are things left to do, and you need to find a way to Norg Hollow. I don't want to talk to you right now. You can't waste time. Finish it and move on. Don't fail your ancestors. Don't talk to me about my ancestors." He sighed. "Casey, I am sorry for everything that happened. We can't help what we are. You have to deal with what you have and survive the best you can. I did love your mother. I still do. She made me and allowed me to live long enough to see the end of the Rasky race. Almost. There is still the hedge. And myself. Give me a little time. I'm so tired. I need to sleep." "Burn the hedge. The rest can wait, but that must be done. The Rasky has great power here. That's why Valencia guarded the maze. She could not stop his return, but she could keep him from the power. The maze is an evil place, and if the Rasky does not return, something else will. Burn it. Then turn your thoughts to your return to Norg Hollow. That is your task now. Return home and restore the land of your ancestors. There is nothing left for you here." He had a point. There was nothing for me anywhere. I didn't want to keep the maze. I had felt the evil of the place, but I had another reason. It was the only thing that lay between me and the Green Lake. I raised my hand, and the words were there. Valencia had transferred most of her powers to me, and her magic was strong. The fire spread quickly. There was something soothing about the crackle of the flames and the smell of the smoke. Duma laughed while the hedge burned. It irritated me, and I shoved him into my backpack. He protested and fought against the bag for a while, before falling silent. I ignored him, and allowed myself to be absorbed in watching the blaze. It burned all night. In the morning, the ashes still smoldered. Pockets of hot red embers were hidden under the soot. From my place at the library window, they looked like giant fiery freckles on a mottled gray face. Beyond, through the smoke and ash, I could see the place where the land sloped down to the foot of the mountains. That was where I would go next. Everything else could wait. I wanted to see that lake. Dumavine didn't complain. I had placed him back on his shelf in the library and left him there. He wiggled a bit in protest, but soon gave up. I could not bring myself to enter the hidden room, so avoiding him was easy. I set out at dawn and carefully picked my way over the scorched ground and piles of ash. I took only my knife. The blood from the man in black still stained the blade. Nothing I had tried would wash it away. I tied it to my belt and tried not to think about it. Killing him had felt too natural. It scared me to know what was inside of me. I tried to block it from my mind and think only of the lake. I walked for most of the day and reached the marshy lands at the lake's edge just as the sun was setting. In the half-light of dusk, everything looked blue and dreamlike. The surface of the water was covered in thick algae, which glowed brilliantly in the fading sun. Tall grass encircled the lake except in one place on the northern shore. An overgrown path ran along the edge, and I followed it. The moon rose. It was full and made the journey easier. I did not feel afraid. Before, I would have been too terrified to even step outside on a night like this. But I was a different person than the invisible girl who had finished her sophomore year of high school, having only spoken to 4 people. I feared nothing in this world. My powers gave me strength, and my step did not falter. I walked through the darkness and reached the opening in the tall grass, just as the sky began to lighten. The path ended at a rock wall that bordered the lake. The algae grew a few yards from the shore, and the water between was still and dark. There was a small stony beach, lined with large boulders that formed natural benches. I sat down, exhausted from a full day and night of walking. My legs and feet ached and were beginning to cramp. I removed my shoes and massaged my aching muscles. The early morning silence was broken by the sharp call of a loon. The sound startled me, and I jumped up and drew my knife. The surface of the lake began to bubble. Small waves rolled up over my toes. The water was ice cold and slimy. Something was moving toward me. I could see the ripple in the water. I felt a presence approaching, powerful and fierce. Yet somehow I knew it was nothing I needed to fear. Her head appeared a few yards out. The slime crowned her as she broke through into the sunlight. She was hideous to behold, and yet strangely beautiful at the same time. Her hair hung in wet tangles around her cold blue shoulders. Slime clung to her face just below her dark eyes, and dripped from her pale lips. She rose from the water and approached me, clothed in lakeweed and a thicker, darker slime that must have come from the deeper parts of the lake. She stood with her face just inches from mine, but I did not back away, not even when she smiled and showed me her pointed teeth. She laughed. The sound was thick and wet. "I see that you are a lot like your mother, Casey. I like that." She went to the bench and sat down, patting the space beside her with her hand. "Come sit with me." I joined her, and we sat in silence for a while. She seemed relaxed and in no hurry to speak again. I looked at her out of the corner of my eye, trying to discover who she might be. But in all the memories I had received from Valencia, I could find no recollection of this strange lake queen. She laughed again. "I knew your mother, not Valencia. She kept our friendship a secret, for Valencia distrusted anyone she could not understand. She would not have liked me. I was also a friend to your grandmother, Clara's mother, and she and Valencia never got along. She was cast out of the house soon after her coming of age, and left to fight the Rasky alone. She was only permitted to return when she bore Clara. No, your great-grandmother would not have liked me at all." I sat in stunned silence, unable to tear my eyes from her terrible face. I knew almost nothing about my grandmother. Valencia never spoke of her, and I had always assumed that she died early and terribly. It did not go well for Della. She had very little training, and they found her quickly. Unlike the others, there was no seduction. They captured her and tortured her until she revealed the location of Valencia and your mother. There were other witches in Crystal River then, and she betrayed them all. The carnage was great, but Della was spared. She renounced her ancestors and her power. She became a shell of the woman she had been. Once she was of no more use, the Rasky abandoned her and left her to waste away while they hunted for the remaining 2, Valencia and Clara. That is how I found her. She wandered in a stupor to the shores of this lake and entered the water without my permission. She was lucky I was the one who found her. My servants are terrible and bloodthirsty. They would have killed her instantly. Indeed, they have been ordered to kill any who trespass here. She gave me another horrible grin. Slime dripped from her mouth. I felt my stomach lurch, but I tried to return the smile. She patted my knee with her ice-cold, claw-like hand. You have nothing to fear, Casey. I loved your mother very much, and I promised her long ago to protect you if you ever came to me, though I sense that you have done well on your own already. There is much of your mother in you, and Valencia as well. They were both powerful witches, yet I think you will be the most powerful of all. What happened to my grandmother? I found it difficult to speak in the presence of this woman, and a wave of fear washed over me when she turned to look at me. Her face was sad, an emotion that made her awful features even more revolting. Della was almost gone when I found her. Valencia had taken Clara into hiding, and Della had come to my lake seeking death. I tried to protect her for a while. I'll admit I was mostly interested in meeting Clara, for the Rasky had been defeated and sent back to regain power before returning again. I gave Della a home for the rest of the time she was alive. She did not last long. My world is not for everyone. Living there can be very draining. Renouncing her identity made her weak, and my land finished her, though I made sure she was as comfortable as possible until she passed. She was a good friend, and I miss her still. Clara was some comfort. She came to me not long after Della's passing. Her desire to find her mother led her here, against Valencia's wishes, I might add. She was a special woman. Your mother did not fear me, even at our first meeting. Usually people flee in terror at the sight of me, but she just stood on the shore and waited. Like you did, Casey. You are the second person to face me unafraid. And so I welcome you to Lychee, my world beneath the water. Will you come with me? I have something I wish to show you. She extended her hand to me. It was cold and slimy, but I gripped it tightly as we approached the scum-covered lake. She sang as we entered the water and waded up to our waists. A huge bubble rose up from the depths. Without pausing, the lake queen stepped through its slimy surface and pulled me in after her. We descended deep into the darkness of the lake. The water was murky and green. Sunlight fought through the gloom in some places, creating twisting shadows between the golden beams. Through the shafts of green and gold light, I saw shapes darting in and out, and briefly glimpsed grotesque faces and eyes that were glowing and filled with madness. The lake queen laughed when one of the more terrible creatures swam at us, and I jumped back against her. She waved her hand, and a golden light surrounded us. Now I could see nothing beyond the bubble, but it didn't make me feel more comfortable. I was beginning to wonder if I had made a grave mistake in blindly trusting this strange woman. You have nothing to fear. I am Queen of Lychee, and no one will harm you while you are my guest. I promise that you will return to shore, unharmed, by dawn tomorrow. I only wish to show you something your mother left behind, and to make you my friend, if that is possible. Our worlds united would be a powerful force. Her eyes had changed, and were now as golden as the light around us. I felt as if she could see right through me, into my thoughts and the places in my mind that even I was not acquainted with. When I say your world, I do not mean the human world. They are beyond our help. You must find Norg Hollow and restore the race of witches to prominence. I don't know where to begin. Your mother did, and she left something for you. She knew you would come here. Your mother saw the future with great clarity, and she accepted her fate. Her one mistake was the creation of Doomavine. That book never should have come into being. He is the one tie the Rasky King has left to you, and he will bring them back to hunt you if he can. Do not listen to him. If you will trust me, bring him to me 4 days after your return from Lychee. I will handle him. You should not be the one to destroy him. Your father's blood should not soil your hands, no matter who he was. I didn't know how to answer her, and we finished our trip in silence. The light inside dimmed, and I could again see outside the bubble. Lychee was more terrifying and beautiful than I had expected. Tall, jagged buildings rose up from the lake bottom, dotted with rough openings in the rock. Horrible creatures slipped in and out of the openings. None were as human as the queen, and I wondered how she became so unlike her people, and why they would willingly follow someone so different from themselves. Once again, she seemed to read my thoughts. I appear this way for your benefit. My true appearance would be too terrible for you to witness. You would go mad. But do not fear. You are my guest, and none shall harm you. I only want to give you something, and then you may return to your home. What do you have to show me? Patience, dear. You will soon see. The golden bubble drifted through the murky city. Creatures that came too close to it were blinded by the golden light, stiffened, and floated, motionless, to the lake bottom. The queen seemed unconcerned, and we drifted on until we reached the castle. The peaks of the mountainous form rose high above us, disappearing into the gloom. The bubble floated up to the entrance of the castle, the only door I had seen in the entire city. The queen moved her hand around my head, before putting her finger through the bubble and bursting it in an explosion of golden light. I gasped as I plunged into the icy water, expecting to feel it fill my lungs, and wondering why I had trusted this horrid woman. The queen laughed, and I opened my eyes. There was a golden globe surrounding my head, a smaller version of the bubble. She didn't say a word, but she motioned for me to follow her through the gate. I swam awkwardly after her, watching her glide through the water, her form shifting from legs to fins. The massive door opened slowly and revealed a dark, shadowy hall, lined with small, bobbing globes of light, and a row of servants, each more terrifying than the next. I saw their eyes grow wide when they saw me, but they said nothing. Some trembled before me, fear overcoming them until the queen spoke a few words, and their shaking ceased. I followed her into a large room. At the center was her throne, a huge rock carved to look like a giant set of jaws. She settled herself inside them, and called forth a servant carrying a smaller seat. It was shaped like an armchair, and covered with some kind of underwater moss that was cold and soft and slimy. I tried to be polite and look comfortable, but the sensation of the moss was unnerving. It writhed beneath me, and I couldn't help feeling that it would soon wrap itself around me and hold me captive until I drowned. The queen laughed. It would indeed, if I allowed it. It would also like to pop that bubble around your head and watch you suffer. But you are safe. Everything in this lake answers to me. She snapped her fingers, and 2 more servants appeared, pulling a large silver trunk between them. They placed it before us and departed swiftly, though not before casting an inquisitive look in my direction. Their eyes were green and glowed slightly in the dimness, and their faces were full of hate. The queen paid no attention to them after they placed the trunk before her. She knelt and held her finger over the lock, speaking quietly, so low I couldn't make out the words. There was a click, muffled slightly by the water, and then the trunk lid floated open. She lifted a box from the trunk and handed it to me. Open it. The box was beautiful, wooden and carved with pretty designs. Blue and green jewels were set into the cover in the shape of a sea. My hands shook as I lifted the lid, knowing that what I held had once been in my mother's hands. There was a packet inside, some kind of water-resistant parchment, but every page was blank. I looked questioningly at the queen, knowing I did not need to speak the thoughts that were filling my mind. You cannot read them here. The words will appear when the parchment dries. It is a letter from your mother. Clara came to me just before she died. She was trapped in a love triangle with both sides of the Rasky king, and she knew her end was fast approaching. She wanted you to have this after your coming of age, and for some reason she did not trust Valencia with it. She left it with me, and seemed sure that you would come here when the time was right. I could feel tears trying to escape, and my heart was pounding. Over the years I had bottled up my feelings about my mother, rarely allowing myself to think about her or my father. Valencia had been more than willing to avoid the topic, and had never mentioned her without my prompting. I couldn't stop myself now. My tears were hot as they poured down my cheeks. The Lake Queen did not speak. She watched me with a face purposefully blank, until the tears slowed and I was able to breathe again. You can't take it with you today. I know that seems cruel, but it is the only insurance I have that you will bring me what I want. Duma. Yes, I want Dumavine brought here. He has caused enough trouble. It is time for his destruction. But he's my father. The Queen laughed. Your father was half of the great Rasky, bred for evil and nothing more. Dumavine is nothing but your mother's pathetic attempt to hold on to her lover. She died for her foolishness. He cannot exist. The Rasky King must be completely destroyed. He helped me. I would have lost if he hadn't been in the game with me. I'm sure he did, but I am also certain that he had motives other than your best interest at heart. The thing you need to ask yourself is which is more important, your mother's letters and the instructions for locating the land of your foremothers, or a book, a small piece of your father's soul, which is evil to the core. I need to think about this. She settled back in her throne and placed her fingertips together. She didn't look at me, but she had a small, satisfied smile on her face. Very well. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. She waved her hand, and I was once again encased in a large bubble. As it began to float away, she took my mother's letters and waved them at me before placing them back in their box. She shut them in the trunk, and her servants moved forward to take them away, as the bubble carried me out of the castle and back to the shore. Chapter 12. Dumavine was angry when I returned. I entered the library quietly, expecting to find him trapped in his place on the shelf, but he was lying on the floor and started bouncing around in anger when I walked in. Where have you been? Do you know how uncomfortable it is on that shelf? After everything I did for you, you just put me away, deny me my freedom, and treat me as badly as that horrid old woman did. You're an ungrateful girl, and I won't be surprised if you fail your mother and your ancestors, and send Norg Hollow into oblivion before this is all over. It is all over. I destroyed the great Rasky. He's not coming back. Duma didn't say anything. His pages curled into a smile, and I briefly glimpsed his face. I had never seen it before. He had always been just a blank cover with his name emblazoned across it. It was not my father's face, but something much worse, something evil and grotesque. I shivered, and my arms broke out in gooseflesh. I scooped him up off the floor and returned him to his shelf. As I replaced him, the door to the hidden room swung open. I hadn't dared to enter the room since Valencia's passing, but now I felt the need to go there. I wanted to feel close to her again, and maybe find a clue to what Duma was up to. The room was dark. The swirling light was extinguished. It must have been connected to Valencia, and went out when she did. I lit some candles and sat down on the sofa. I let my eyes roam around the room, unsure of where to begin or what I was looking for. I stayed like that for hours, looking into every corner of the room, probing the darkness over and over. Finally, I went to the shelves and began searching through the dusty trinkets. It took hours, and I was ready to give up and go to bed when I found the key. There was a shelf of bottles, each made of blue glass and covered with a thick layer of gray dust. I opened each bottle and smelled the liquids inside. I don't know why I did it, but something was driving my search. I just did whatever seemed right. The key was under one of them. It was small, round, and old, though the brass was shiny and unmarred. I picked it up and held it in the palm of my hand, studying it and trying to decide what to do next. As I moved around the room, my eyes landed on a lavender chair that had been placed in the corner. It had been there for as long as I had, but we had never sat in it. Valencia always kept a potted African violet on the seat. For some reason, that had never struck me as odd until that moment. I moved the violet and sat down. The chair faced the wall with the sofa. Above it was a painting that was framed in silver. The background was a deep blue, covered in gray shapes and designs. The gray was dark, and it was hidden easily in the gloom, I had never noticed it before. The center shape, the main focus of the painting, was a keyhole. I jumped up and ran to lift the painting, but the wall behind it was empty. I replaced the painting and tentatively placed the key into the painted keyhole. It fit. I turned it and there was a click. The wall began to glow. A door appeared, and I turned the knob and walked through. The walls of the room were gray stone and empty. There was a small table carved from dark wood. On it sat a big black stone bowl filled with golden glittering sand. I walked around the room, running my hands over the walls and looking for crevices or secret passages. But that didn't feel right. I went to the bowl of sand and plunged my hands into it. The sand was hot and began crawling up my arms immediately. I pulled my hands away quickly, and the sand shot into the air and poured onto the floor in front of me. It rose up before me and took the shape of a woman. Valencia. It hurt me to see her looking so young and happy. The sand shifted, and she looked at me gravely. Casey, if you have found this, then you have learned to doubt Dumavine and follow your instincts. I am very proud of you. There is something you should know about Dumavine, and it will help make it easier for you to do what needs to be done. The sand was in constant motion. Valencia's features shifted and changed. She wore a sad smile. The first thing you need to know is that your father, the real one, loved your mother very much. He was mostly a kind man, though he was half of the Rasky king. His outbursts of anger were few, and when they did occur, they were over quickly. The sand Valencia hesitated. Your mother loved him too. She really did. But she had these episodes. She was always very needy and had to indulge her feelings. When she met Nix, she just couldn't help herself. He was the other half of the Rasky, which gave him the power to draw her to him and to manipulate her emotions. She fell head over heels in love with him. There was nothing she could do. Now I have come to the reason for this message. Nix charmed your mother, hypnotized her, and convinced her to create Dumavine. What his plans were, I am unsure, but I believe he was looking for a way to safeguard his existence. It took a great amount of effort to release your mother from his spell. Once free, her love for Nix was broken, but it increased her love for your father even more. She was thrilled by the existence of Dumavine and refused to give him up. She knew that he would have to die if she was to survive, but she wanted to hold on to him for as long as she could. And she wanted him for your sake as well. She wanted you to know your father. I don't know why I kept him after she was killed. I told myself I wanted to study him, listen to what he had to say, and try to discover his true motives. But I think the real reason I kept him was out of respect and love for Clara. That troublesome book was too mouthy, and he made it clear he had no love for me. He refused to talk about Nix or answer any of my questions, so I put him away on the shelf soon after her death. He demanded that I give him to you, but I could not allow that. I wanted you to be spared the knowledge of your birth and your destiny for as long as possible. I'm sorry if this angers you, but I just did not think it was wise. I wanted you to have a normal childhood, or as normal as possible for the child of a reputed witch. I have spent countless hours searching for the purpose to Dumavine's creation. All I can guess is that he was created to keep a small piece of the Rasky in this world, while the rest of it regroups and gains power until it can return again and track down the next witch. He must be destroyed, Casey. I'm just not sure how to do it. Your mother knew, but she would not tell me. Maybe you will have better luck discovering her secret. Be strong, my dear girl. I will always be with you. The sand dropped to the ground in a gray heap that washed over my toes. I scooped it up as best I could and returned it to the stone bowl, but the golden glitter was gone. I went back to the library, dejected and confused. Duma thumped in his place on the shelf, but I paid him no attention, and instead crossed over to the window. The remains of the hedge smoked, and the backyard now looked like a wasteland. Nothing but black charred ground surrounding the house and extending far into the distance. Just beyond the blackness lay the green lake, lychee, and my mother's letters. The choice was clear, and my path was laid before me. I knew what had to be done and how to do it, but it was hard to reconcile my feelings. I decided to go to bed and wait until morning, when my thoughts were clearer. I was always more hopeful in the light of early morning. Night had never failed to bring doubt and fear cloaked in its darkness. It was already quite late, so I went to the door and turned out the light. Just before I left, I stopped and whispered, "Good night, Dad." It felt strange to say those words, and I fled, giving Duma no time to reply. I ran to my room and threw myself onto the mattress. I cried myself to sleep, sobbing until I had no energy left, and collapsed into a heavy stupor. The morning came much too quickly. I opened my eyes, feeling no more refreshed than when I had fallen asleep. My head pounded from the excessive crying, and the morning light hurt my eyes. I groaned and groggily went to the window. I had slept in my clothes, and my mouth tasted like an old sock. I moved slowly to the kitchen and made a pot of coffee. Valencia had never let me drink coffee. She said it was too stimulating for a young girl, but I had tried it a couple times and liked the way that it brought everything into sharp focus. I needed it this morning. I leaned against the counter and slowly drank my first cup. The kitchen seemed so empty without Valencia's presence. She had been a wonderful cook and truly enjoyed herself when she was in the kitchen. I could still hear the echoes of her laughter as I stood there. My thoughts drifted next to my mother's letters. I hoped that they would show me how to find Norg Hollow. I wanted to get away from this house. It hurt to walk through the rooms and remember. I couldn't escape outside because every place was a reminder of Blade, and that pain was still fresh and cut deep. I filled a travel mug with coffee and went to the library. I picked up my backpack and went to the shelf where Duma was thumping impatiently. The whole wall shook with his efforts. He had already knocked several of the old dusty books to the floor. I removed him from the shelf. "Well, it's about time you came to your senses. I hate being on that shelf. It's so confining." "I hope you like my backpack better," I said as I stuffed him in and hurriedly zipped up the bag. I shouldered it and picked up my mug. Duma fought for a while, but soon grew quiet. I left the house and started across the backyard, following a mostly straight path to the green lake. My heart was full of fear and doubt, but also a growing excitement. Walking seemed too slow, and I started to run. A feeling of urgency came over me, and I couldn't get back to the lake fast enough. I feared as I approached the small beach that she wouldn't be there, that nobody would be there to help me find Lychee. But the queen appeared as soon as I set foot in the water. The bubble carried us down in silence. The queen did not speak, or even look at me. Her face was grim and unreadable. This time the bubble didn't take us through the front door of the castle. It slipped around the perimeter of the building and into a side entrance. We entered a tube and floated up the length of the castle, and into a small room where the water did not reach the ceiling. We floated to the top, and the bubble popped, leaving me to tread water to keep afloat. The queen floated next to me, effortlessly, without moving her arms or legs. I could feel Duma fighting in my backpack, and quickly removed it and took him out, holding him above the water as he sputtered and flapped his wet pages. "Hello, Duma Vine." The queen's voice came out harsh and strangled. Duma froze, his pages left half open. "Lucia." His voice was different. No longer the voice of my father, but someone or something far worse. The queen was watching him with a hungry expression on her face, and he trembled in my hands. His fear was real. "Yes, I have followed you for so many years, and now here we are." She reached out for him, and as I placed him in her hands, he began to scream. Smoke billowed from under his cover, and his pages blackened and curled. Lucia smiled as he burst into flames with another tortured scream. She spoke in a low, chanting voice. The words were foreign, but the sound was like waves crashing on a rocky shore. She and Duma fell silent at the same moment. By then he was nothing more than a pile of ash held in her cupped hands. Our eyes met as she released the ash into the water. We watched it sink in silence. When we could see no more, she looked at me with a kind smile. "Thank you, Casey. You cannot know the relief you have brought me. Dumavine and I have had a difficult relationship. I once thought we were in love, but I was merely a tool for hunting witches. I'm ashamed to say that I helped him at first. This was long before I met Della or Clara. I was so blinded by love that I didn't see the truth right in front of me." She gave me a sad smile. "I'm truly sorry, Casey. I helped accelerate the downfall of the witches, and I would take it all back if I could. I hope you can understand, even if you cannot forgive me. Where are my mother's letters? Come with me." She wrapped me in a new bubble, and we went to the throne room. The trunk was brought before us, and she opened it and handed the box to me. I opened the lid slowly and removed the blank parchments. They shimmered in the gloomy water, alive and filled with magic and love. I could feel my mother's presence, and I held them close to my heart. The Queen smiled. "Go, Casey. Find Norg Hollow and return the witches to what they once were. Do not trust anyone you meet on the way. Though the Rasky King is gone, there are others who would harm you, some far worse than the Raskies. I wish you luck on your journey. It is not an easy task, being the future of an entire race." She came forward and stepped into the bubble with me. She hugged me in a motherly way and kissed my forehead. Her embrace was cold and slimy, but not completely unpleasant. She stepped from the bubble and waved her hand. As I floated away, she settled back onto her throne. She looked exhausted, and her appearance began to shift and change as I rounded the corner and lost sight of her. The trip back to the shore was uneventful, though many of the lake creatures stopped what they were doing to watch me depart. There was a feeling of exhaustion, but also a sense of joy. The mood was lighter, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from them. Some even tried to smile, a gruesome sight, but I tried not to show my disgust as I smiled in return. The bubble reached the surface and burst. I was shot into the air and landed hard on the shore. My mother's letters were held close against me. I picked myself up off the ground and spread the wet parchment out on the rocks. Then I sat down and waited for the sun to dry them.